For about 40 years, right after World War II, all the way up to 1980, the United States was caught in this incredibly tense global standoff. Its entire foreign policy was this constant, high-stakes tightrope walk, with the fate of the whole world hanging in the balance.
And that brings us to the central question of the entire era, really. How could the United States push back against Soviet power and try to build a whole new security system for the world without accidentally kicking off a totally catastrophic World War III? I mean, that was the fundamental dilemma facing every single president for generations.
So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at how the world basically split in two right after the war. Then, we'll dig into the American strategy designed to deal with that split. After that, we'll see how that strategy morphed into direct confrontation. And finally, how the absolutely terrifying threat of nuclear annihilation forced a pivot towards negotiation.
Okay, so it all started the Second World War II ended. That wartime alliance between the US and the Soviet Union, it just evaporated, almost overnight. And what was left was this deep, profound mutual distrust and two completely opposite visions for what the post-war world should look like.
And these two systems, they were like oil and water. On one side, you've got the US vision of democratic capitalism, all about individual freedoms and free markets. On the other side, the Soviet Union's authoritarian communism, which is centered on total state control and one-party rule. And here's the crucial part. Neither side felt like they could just coexist. Each one saw the other's expansion as a literal existential threat to their way of life.
Well, this ideological fight very quickly became a physical one. Stalin moved to lock down Soviet control over Eastern Europe, creating what he saw as a necessary buffer zone against the West. And this is what led Winston Churchill to famously declare that an iron curtain had descended across the continent. And you got to understand that wasn't just a metaphor. He was describing a real guarded, hostile border that was splitting Europe clean in two.
So what was the U.S. response to all this? Faced with this expanding threat, American policymakers came up with a strategy that would literally define their foreign policy for the next 40 years. And it was called the Doctrine of Containment.
So what is containment exactly? Well, in the simplest terms, it was a policy of drawing a line in the sand. The goal wasn't to roll back or destroy communism where it already was, but to stop it from spreading 1 inch further. The plan was to use every tool they had, diplomacy, money, and military might, to apply firm, consistent pressure wherever the Soviets tried to push.
Now, this wasn't just some idea they pulled out of a hat. It had a really solid intellectual foundation. Back in 1946, a U.S. diplomat in Moscow named George Kennan sent this incredibly influential cable back to Washington. It's now famous as the Long Telegram. And his key argument was this. Yes, the Soviets are expansionist, but they're also pragmatic. They won't risk the destruction of their own regime, and they will back down if they run into a brick wall of firm resistance.
And boy, did they put that theory into practice fast. Just 1 year later, you get the Truman Doctrine. The U.S. committed a massive $400 million in aid to Greece and Turkey, who were both fighting off communist insurgencies. This was it. This was the moment containment went from theory to official U.S. policy. The U.S. was basically declaring itself the global protector of any free nation resisting a takeover.
But the first really big tool of containment, it wasn't guns, it was cash. Through the Marshall Plan, the U.S. poured over $13 billion, that's in 1940s money, into rebuilding the totally shattered economies of Western Europe. The thinking here was just brilliant. People who are desperate, living in ruins, might see communism as an answer. So by rebuilding their countries, the U.S. was creating a kind of economic vaccine, making democracy and capitalism look a whole lot more stable and attractive.
But, as you can probably guess, containment couldn't just be about economics for long. The strategy started to shift, moving more towards direct confrontation. And the first major test of this new approach wasn't a shooting war, but a battle of logistics, fought with airplanes. And it would set the stage for decades of military buildup to come. So in 1948, the Soviets decided to blockade all land and water routes into West Berlin. They were trying to starve the city into surrendering. The Allied response was the Berlin Airlift. And the scale of this thing is just, it's hard to wrap your head around. Over 200,000 flights in less than a year, delivering everything from food to fuel. It was an absolutely massive win for containment, a powerful show of peaceful resolve that stopped a Soviet takeover without firing a single shot.
Now, the tension from that Berlin crisis led directly to something a little more permanent. In 1949, the U.S. and its Western European allies formed NATO. This was a formal military alliance, and it was built on one incredibly simple, powerful principle. An attack on one member is considered an attack on all of them. That line in the sand was now backed up by a treaty and a whole lot of firepower.
But containment wasn't always going to be peaceful. Its first truly bloody test came in 1950, when Communist North Korea invaded the South. The U.S. jumped in, leading a UN force to push them back. But then China got involved, and the war ground down into this brutal 3-year stalemate. In the end, it finished right back where it started, but it proved that military containment was going to come at an enormous cost, both in human lives and in dollars.
And all while this was happening, something far, far more terrifying was going on in the background. The nuclear arms race was escalating at a breathtaking speed. The U.S. gets the atomic bomb in 45. The Soviets test their own just 4 years later in 49. And by 1953, both sides had developed the hydrogen bomb, a weapon that was orders of magnitude more powerful. The stakes of the Cold War had just been raised to an unimaginable level.
This new reality led to the grim but terrifyingly simple logic of mutual assured destruction, or MAD for short. The whole idea was that if either superpower launched a nuclear first strike, the other side would still have enough nukes left to retaliate and completely annihilate the attacker. So this balance of terror, as they called it, ironically became the main thing preventing an all-out war.
So if the ultimate fight is now literally unthinkable, how do you even practice containment anymore? This new nuclear reality forced another big evolution in strategy. The answer was to shift away from constant confrontation and move towards careful management and, believe it or not, negotiation. And the ultimate test of this mad logic came in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. For 13 days, with Soviet missiles in Cuba pointed at the U.S., the entire world just held its breath. We have never been closer to nuclear war. The crisis was eventually solved through these intense, back-channel diplomatic talks, precisely because both leaders, Kennedy and Khrushchev, understood that a full-scale war was completely unwinnable for everybody. The absolute shock of the Cuban Missile Crisis, plus the sheer exhaustion from the Vietnam War, led to the next major strategic pivot, a period known as détente. Now, this wasn't about the US and Soviets becoming friends, not at all. It was a purely pragmatic easing of tensions. With both sides at a rough nuclear parity, the goal of containment shifted from winning the rivalry to simply managing it, so you don't blow up the entire planet.
And this whole era was really defined by two huge diplomatic plays. First, President Nixon's historic opening to China, which completely upended the chessboard and gave the U.S. new leverage over Moscow. And second was the SALT I Treaty, which was the first time the superpowers ever formally agreed to put a cap on their strategic nuclear arsenals. Containment, it turned out, could also mean sitting down and making a deal.
So when you take a step back and look at the whole picture, the core goal of U.S. policy, containing Soviet power, stayed remarkably consistent for decades. But the methods, they changed dramatically over time. The strategy evolved from massive economic aid to bloody military showdowns and finally to complex high-stakes negotiation. It was just a constant process of adapting to a very dangerous and ever-changing world.
Which, of course, leaves us with a pretty fundamental question. The entire 40-year balance of the Cold War was ultimately built on the terrifying logic of mutual assured destruction. So you have to ask, is a peace that's guaranteed only by the threat of total annihilation, is that really sustainable in the long run? The legacy of that mad world is still very much with us, making that question just as relevant today as it was back then.